There's a wall in the desert that was carved before the pyramids existed, before Egypt even had a king wearing both crowns, before writing, as we understand it, had fully become writing. And on that wall, someone pressed a message into stone so large, so deliberately, oversized, that it could not have been meant for a single pair of eyes walking past. It was meant to be seen from a distance. It was meant to last, and for more than 5,000 years it simply waited there, in silence, until someone finally walked close enough to read it. That place is called El Kawi, a stretch of rock in southern Egypt, and what researchers found carved into it is now considered one of the oldest and largest surviving lines of hieroglyphic symbols ever discovered. Not a tomb painting, not a temple inscription protected behind stone walls for millennia, an open message carved into a cliff face, exposed to wind and sun and time, and somehow it survived long enough for archaeologists from Yale and from the Royal Museums of Art and History in Brussels to stand in front of it and realize what they were looking at. 4 images, a bull's head mounted on a pole, 2 long-necked storks facing away from each other, and between them, a bald ibis. To a modern eye, they look like little more than desert graffiti, faint outlines pressed into rock. But to the people who study the earliest years of Egyptian writing, this panel is something close to a birth certificate. It shows the moment when picture-making began to turn into language. The bull's head is believed to represent royal power, the earliest hints of the idea of a king. The birds are tied to the solar cycle, the sun's endless loop across the sky, a symbol of order that repeats forever. Put together, the carving seems to link the earliest rulers of Egypt to the responsibility of keeping the universe itself in balance, not just governing people, governing the cosmos. And here's the detail that turns a fascinating archaeological find into something that feels almost eerie. The symbols are big, deliberately, unmistakably big. Big enough to be read from a distance by someone walking along the Nile Valley thousands of years ago, which raises an unsettling question that historians still turn over. Who exactly was this message for? Because if it was meant to be visible from far away, then whoever carved it wanted it to be seen by more than just the few people living nearby. They wanted a message about cosmic order, about a king's duty to hold the universe together, broadcast as widely as stone and sunlight would allow. It's not hard to see why some corners of the internet ran with a wilder interpretation. Some outlets and video creators have framed this as a kind of cosmic transmission, a message left for something beyond human eyes, a signal sent outward rather than a message sent to travelers. That is not what Egyptologists actually claim. But it's easy to understand the impulse. There is something genuinely unsettling about staring at a 5,000-year-old symbol clearly built to be seen from far away, and realizing that we still don't fully know the boundaries of who far away was supposed to mean. Now, if El Kawi is the discovery that keeps getting reframed as something otherworldly, there's another set of hieroglyphs that has spent decades feeding a very different kind of scary story. This one lives inside the temple of Seti I at Abydos, one of the most sacred and significant sites in all of ancient Egypt. Abydos was a place of pilgrimage tied to the worship of Osiris, god of the afterlife, and it holds one of the most extraordinary surviving structures from the ancient world, a mysterious underground building called the Osirion, whose original purpose is still debated by scholars today. But it's not the Osirion that made this place famous on the internet. It's a small section of carved ceiling inside the temple, a section that has been nicknamed, only half-jokingly, the helicopter hieroglyphs. Look at a photograph of this carving without any context, and your brain will do something strange. It will insist, almost immediately, that it recognizes shapes it should not recognize. A helicopter, unmistakably, silhouette and all. Beside it, something that looks disturbingly like a modern airplane. Further along, shapes that some viewers swear resemble a submarine, or some kind of futuristic flying craft. This is stone, carved more than 3,000 years ago, in a temple built for a pharaoh named Seti I. And yet, there they are. Machines that, as far as we know, would not exist for another 3,000 years. For decades, this image has been one of the internet's favorite pieces of evidence for the idea that ancient Egyptians either had contact with time travelers, or had access to lost, advanced technology, or were visited by beings who left behind knowledge no one back then should have possessed. It shows up endlessly in videos with titles almost exactly like the one that probably brought you here. Proof of time travel, hidden in stone, a riddle no one can explain, ancient astronauts, encoded in a temple ceiling. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most widely circulated impossible artifact images in modern pseudo-archaeology, translated and reshared across dozens of languages, stitched into thousands of short videos, endlessly reposted as unshakable proof of something hidden from mainstream history. Here is the part almost none of those videos tell you. The explanation for the helicopter hieroglyphs has been known and documented for a long time, and it has nothing to do with time travel. It comes down to a practice the ancient Egyptians used constantly called palimpsest. When a new pharaoh took the throne and wanted to establish his own legacy, it was common to reuse existing temple surfaces rather than carve entirely new ones. Workers would plaster over the original inscription and carve fresh hieroglyphs on top of it, essentially recording a new message directly over an old one. At Abydos, this is exactly what happened. The original carving from the reign of Seti I read as a phrase meaning something close to "He who repels the 9 enemies of Egypt," a fairly standard royal title celebrating the king's power over Egypt's adversaries. Later, during the reign of his son, Rameses II, the surface was replastered and recarved with a different message. Over the following 3,000 years, the plaster covering both layers slowly eroded. And because it didn't erode evenly, cleanly, or completely, the 2 separate inscriptions, one sitting slightly behind the other, began to bleed into one another visually. Where the newer carving had been chipped away in one spot, and the older carving showed through underneath, unrelated symbol fragments suddenly lined up in ways that, to modern eyes trained on movies and science fiction, look exactly like the silhouette of a helicopter. It isn't a helicopter. It isn't a submarine. It is 2 completely unrelated royal inscriptions, separated by decades, accidentally overlapping after millennia of stone erosion, creating an illusion your brain is extremely good at completing into a shape it already recognizes. This is a well-understood phenomenon. Humans are pattern-matching machines. Give us a handful of ambiguous lines and gaps, and our minds will snap them into the most familiar shape available, which, for anyone raised in the 20th or 21st century, is going to be a helicopter long before it's going to be 2 overlapping pharaonic titles from 3,000 years ago. So why does this keep coming back? Why does a fully explained, extensively documented case of temple palimpsest keep getting relaunched as this decade's biggest ancient mystery? Partly because it is, undeniably, a striking image. Even once you know the explanation, it is hard to look at that shape and not feel a small jolt of, that really does look exactly like a helicopter. Partly because boring reused stone surface eroded unevenly is simply a less exciting sentence than forbidden proof of time travel hidden by archaeologists. And partly because these videos rarely engage with the actual explanation at all. They show the image, ask the question, imply the cover-up, and end. The debunking exists. It has existed for years, from historians and Egyptologists who have walked through exactly how the overlapping carvings occurred. It simply doesn't travel nearly as fast or as far as the mystery does. But the helicopter hieroglyphs aren't the only reason Abydos, and Egyptian tombs more broadly, have earned a reputation for being unsettling. Because buried in the walls of real tombs, not reused ceiling panels but original intentional inscriptions, are some of the most openly threatening pieces of writing that have survived from the ancient world. Travel south from Abydos to a site called Saqqara, one of the largest and oldest burial grounds in Egypt, home to more than 160 tombs. Some of these tombs are simple, some are almost aggressively decorated with warnings, not subtle warnings, not vague spiritual admonitions, direct, specific, violent threats carved in plain hieroglyphic language, aimed squarely at anyone who might think about disturbing the dead inside. One of the most striking examples comes from the tomb of a nobleman named Kentika Ekeki. Inside, alongside the inscriptions celebrating his life and status, there is a curse. It essentially states that whoever enters this tomb in a state of impurity will be seized by the neck the way a bird is seized and executed on the spot. Not metaphorically threatened with bad luck, not warned of misfortune down the road. Directly told that the punishment will be a physical, violent death carried out by supernatural means immediately upon violation. Another comes from the tomb of a man named Hezi, also at Saqqara. His inscription begins the way many tomb texts do, recounting his life, his position, his accomplishments. And then, without much warning, it pivots into a threat aimed at anyone who might enter the tomb after committing certain moral or ritual violations, warning that such a person would be judged directly by the council of the great god. What makes this one particularly strange, according to those who study it, is that the wording seems to implicate not just the potential intruder, but Hezi himself. Almost as if the curse is designed to hold everyone inside that moral boundary accountable, the dead included. According to specialists who study these inscriptions, the language used in several of these curses reflects a specific concern held by the Egyptians about certain kinds of impurity tied to particular acts considered ritually unclean before entering a sacred burial space. The tombs weren't just graves, they were considered active, spiritually charged locations, and the curses functioned as a kind of security system, a threat meant to work on the mind of anyone standing at the entrance deciding whether to go further. Did these curses work? In the most literal sense, obviously not. Tomb robbery in ancient Egypt was rampant, a problem that plagued nearly every dynasty. forcing pharaohs to build increasingly elaborate hidden burial chambers specifically because open threats carved into stone were not enough to stop determined thieves. But there is something genuinely unnerving about the fact that these curses have outlived their targets by thousands of years. The tomb robbers those inscriptions were written for died millennia ago. The pharaohs who ordered the warnings carved died millennia ago. And still, right now, in this moment, that threat is sitting exactly where it was placed, fully legible, fully intact, still technically addressed to whoever happens to be standing in front of it. Which, if you've ever stood in an Egyptian tomb, or even looked closely at a photograph of one, means the threat is technically addressed to you. This idea that ancient Egyptian curses reach forward through time and land on whoever disturbs them eventually crystallized into one of the most famous supposed curses in modern history, the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs, which exploded into public consciousness after the tomb of a young king named Tutankhamun was opened in the 1920s. The story goes that shortly after the tomb was unsealed, a string of unexplained deaths and misfortunes struck those connected to the excavation, feeding newspaper headlines around the world, convinced that an ancient curse had been unleashed. It's one of the most enduring pieces of Egyptian mythology and modern pop culture, endlessly referenced in films, books, and documentaries. And it is also, according to the overwhelming consensus of historians and statisticians who have studied the actual death records of everyone involved in that excavation, almost entirely a media invention. A story built more on dramatic coincidence and sensational reporting than on any pattern that holds up to scrutiny. Most of the people connected to that tomb's discovery lived long, ordinary lives. The handful of high-profile deaths that did occur shortly after the opening were seized on by newspapers hungry for a sensational story, and the legend simply never stopped growing from there. None of this would be nearly as compelling, though, if hieroglyphs themselves weren't already inherently mysterious to most of us. For almost 1,500 years after the last person capable of reading them fluently died, hieroglyphic writing sat completely locked, an entire system of thought, religion, law, and daily life rendered silent. Scholars stared at these symbols for centuries and guessed wildly at what they meant, often assuming they were purely symbolic or mystical rather than a functioning written language recording real names, real events, real administrative details. It wasn't until the early 1800s that a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion finally broke the code, using the Rosetta Stone, a single slab of rock carved with the same decree written in 3 different scripts, as the key that unlocked the entire system. Once that door opened, everything that had been silent for over 1,000 years suddenly had a voice again. Tomb curses, royal declarations, love, poems, complaints about neighbors, records of taxes, and yes, warnings meant to frighten off intruders who, at the time those warnings were carved, could not have possibly imagined that one day an entire civilization's worth of language would come flooding back all at once. That rediscovery is part of why hieroglyphs feel uniquely unsettling in a way that other ancient mysteries don't quite match. This wasn't lost technology or an unexplained structure whose purpose we can only guess at. This was language. Actual sentences, written by actual people, addressed, in some cases, quite deliberately, to whoever might be standing there reading them thousands of years later. When a modern person stands in front of a curse carved at Saqqara, they are not looking at an ambiguous symbol open to interpretation. They are reading a direct message written by someone who has been dead for over 4,000 years. That was, in a very real sense, written for them. It's worth stepping back for a moment and asking why this particular subject, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, keeps generating this specific flavor of viral content, generation after generation, decade after decade. Part of it is simply how visually striking the material is. Massive stone carvings, eerie tomb interiors, symbols that look alien to modern eyes even when their meaning is completely mundane. Part of it is the genuine scale of Egyptian history. Over 5,000 years of continuous civilization. Plenty of time for palimpsest carvings, erosion patterns, and coincidental symbol alignments to produce images that our pattern-seeking brains can twist into something extraordinary. And part of it, frankly, is that mystery sells better than explanation. A video that says, "Here is an eroded, reused temple ceiling that happens to look like a helicopter due to 2 overlapping inscriptions," is a much harder sell than a video that says, "Archaeologists are hiding proof that ancient Egyptians had helicopters." But here's the thing that actually deserves to be called shocking, once you strip away the manufactured mystery. The real story is, in its own way, just as strange as the fake one. A civilization figured out, independently, how to compress abstract ideas like kingship, cosmic order, morality, and the afterlife into a system of pictures precise enough to survive translation across 5,000 years. They carved messages meant to intimidate the living on behalf of the dead. And those messages are still doing their job, in the sense that people are still reading them, still reacting to them, right now. They built a monumental inscription so large it seems designed to be seen from an impossible distance, and we still don't fully know who they expected to be looking. None of that needs an alien, or a time traveler, or a lost advanced civilization to feel unsettling. It just needs you to actually stop and think about what it means for a threat, or a declaration, or a message about the order of the universe to survive perfectly intact, waiting patiently in stone for more than 5,000 years until the exact moment someone finally arrives who can read it. And that, more than any helicopter-shaped shadow on a temple ceiling, is the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to shake. Not that ancient Egyptians had secret modern technology, not that a message was left for something beyond human eyes, but that language, real, deliberate human language, has this strange power to reach across a gap of 5,000 years and still land exactly the way it was meant to. A curse still reads as a curse. A warning still reads as a warning. A declaration of cosmic responsibility still reads as an enormous, deliberate act of communication, aimed outward into a future its authors could never have seen, but somehow, in some sense, seem to be writing for anyway. There's another layer to this story that rarely makes it into the viral versions, and it has to do with just how close hieroglyphs came to staying silent forever. For nearly a millennium and a half, no living person on Earth could read a single word of them. Priests who once used these symbols daily eventually stopped, temples closed, the old religious order collapsed, and the knowledge required to read hieroglyphic script simply died out with the last generation who held it. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, European scholars looking at Egyptian monuments treated hieroglyphs less like a language and more like a kind of sacred puzzle box. Entire theories were built on the assumption that each symbol represented a mystical concept rather than a sound or a word, and some of history's most respected minds spent years producing confident, elaborate, completely wrong translations. A bird symbol wasn't read as part of a name or a grammatical marker. It was read as an entire abstract philosophical idea, an approach that led nowhere for centuries, because the actual system underneath was far more logical and far more human than anyone assumed. The breakthrough came almost by accident in the form of a broken slab of black rock, uncovered by French soldiers near the town of Rosetta in northern Egypt at the very end of the 18th century. What made that particular stone extraordinary wasn't its size or its craftsmanship, it was the fact that the same decree had been carved onto it 3 separate times, once in hieroglyphic script, once in a simplified everyday Egyptian script called Demotic, and once in ancient Greek. Scholars across Europe could already read Greek fluently, which meant for the first time in over 1,000 years, there was a direct bridge between a language people could understand and a language that had gone completely silent. It still took decades of painstaking comparison, false starts, and rival theories before Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the system in the early 1820s, realizing that hieroglyphs weren't purely symbolic at all, but a mixed system combining sounds, whole words, and category markers, functioning far more like an actual spoken language committed to stone than like a sequence of mystical icons. The moment that realization landed, an entire civilization's private conversations, warnings, prayers, complaints, and threats came rushing back into human hands all at once, after a silence longer than the gap between us and the Roman Empire. It's genuinely worth sitting with how strange that gap is. Rome fell, and roughly 1,000 years passed before anyone in Europe could read what a Roman legionary had scratched onto a wall. Hieroglyphs went silent for even longer than that. An entire span of time, longer than the distance separating us from the fall of Rome, passed with this writing system sitting completely inert, fully, preserved, utterly unreadable, waiting. When people talk about ancient Egypt feeling eerie, feeling like it's hiding something, the silence is very often what they're actually responding to, whether they realize it or not. It isn't that the messages are supernatural, it's that they went quiet for so long and came back so suddenly that it feels almost like they were never meant to be read again at all. We simply weren't supposed to be standing there when the silence finally broke. That sense of things not meant to be seen again shows up in another famous piece of Egyptian imagery that regularly gets folded into the same wave of shocking hieroglyph content, a carving found deep inside the Hathor temple at Dendera, sometimes nicknamed the Dendere light, because of its resemblance, at a glance, to a modern light bulb, complete with what looks like a filament curling inside a glass bulb and a cable running along the base. Viral videos love to frame this one exactly the same way they frame the helicopter carving, as proof of forbidden ancient electricity, a lost technology hidden from the public and quietly ignored by mainstream Egyptology. And once again, the actual explanation, agreed upon by the historians and art specialists who have studied the full context of the carving, is considerably less electric. The image is part of a larger, well-documented mythological scene depicting a lotus flower, giving rise to a serpent, a common and heavily symbolic motif tied to Egyptian creation stories, resting inside a shape that has more to do with religious iconography than industrial engineering. The resemblance to a light bulb is almost entirely coincidental, a case of a specific religious symbol accidentally lining up with an object that didn't exist for another 3,000 years. In exactly the same way, overlapping palimpsest carvings accidentally produced the shape of a helicopter at Abydos. Different site, different symbol, same underlying trick being played on the modern eye, our own pattern recognition doing the heavy lifting that the ancient carvers never intended. What ties El Kawi, Abydos, Saqqara, and Dendera together isn't a single unified mystery waiting to be cracked open. It's something almost more interesting than that, a recurring pattern in how modern audiences relate to ancient Egypt specifically. Very few other ancient civilizations generate this exact kind of content over and over, decade after decade, reused and reframed for each new platform, from tabloid newspapers in the 1920s to late-night television specials in the 90s, to endless short-form videos flooding every phone screen today. Ancient Egypt sits at a strange intersection of being extraordinarily well-documented, with more surviving writing, art, and architecture than almost any other civilization from that period of history, while also carrying just enough genuine unexplained detail, genuine silence, genuine gaps, that it leaves room for anyone determined enough to fill those gaps with whatever story they find most compelling. And to be fair, some of what remains genuinely unexplained deserves real curiosity rather than dismissal. The exact original purpose of the Osirian at Abydos, that mysterious underground structure connected to the worship of Osiris, is still debated among specialists, without full consensus on when it was built or precisely what rituals took place inside it. The engineering behind certain massive stone monuments still raises legitimate, serious questions among archaeologists and engineers about the tools and labor organization required to achieve that level of precision using the technology historically available at the time. These are real open questions, actively studied by real researchers, using real evidence. They simply tend to get far less attention online than a photograph that looks like a helicopter, because a genuine unanswered engineering question doesn't compress into a 15-second video nearly as easily as a single, visually shocking, misleading image does. Which brings this back around to the actual point worth taking away from all of this. The shock, the genuine chill down the spine that ancient Egypt is so good at producing, doesn't come from secret alien technology, or hidden proof of time travelers, or forbidden knowledge being covered up by modern archaeologists. It comes from something far more grounded, and honestly far more haunting once you sit with it properly. It comes from the fact that real human beings, thousands of years ago, carved threats meant to terrify future strangers. And those threats are still sitting there, fully legible, waiting for exactly the kind of person who would dare to read them. It comes from a message carved deliberately oversized into open rock, meant to be seen from a distance that we still don't fully understand, sitting patiently for 5,000 years until the right eyes finally arrived. It comes from an entire language going completely silent for longer than the whole of Roman history, only to come roaring back the moment one broken slab of stone gave scholars the key they needed. None of that needs to be exaggerated into something it isn't. The real story already carries the weight. A civilization figured out how to speak directly to a future it could never see, using nothing but stone, pigment, and an extraordinary act of foresight. And in more ways than one, they succeeded. We are still listening. We are still, in a very real sense, exactly the people they were writing to. And once you understand that these carvings weren't riddles left by outsiders, but deliberate human messages addressed across an almost unimaginable gap of time directly to whoever eventually learned to read them, the truly unsettling question stops being who built this and starts being something much simpler and much harder to shake. What else, out there in the sand, still hasn't been read yet? And what exactly is it waiting to say to whoever finally arrives?